My brother dragged me to meet his fiancee's millionaire mother at the rehearsal dinner. He smirked, pointing right at me, saying, "This is our family failure, please excuse her." My parents chimed in, adding they never brag about me. But the wealthy woman did not laugh. Instead, she looked at me, froze completely, and said quietly, "So it is you, I recognize your work." Before I share how that single moment unraveled my family's fake empire, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever fought for respect. Growing up in Atlanta, my family cared about two things: the church board and keeping up appearances. When my older brother Terrence got engaged to Lauren, a white woman from a prominent old money family, my parents lost their minds. They wanted to prove we belonged. I arrived late. The country club was suffocatingly elegant with massive floral arrangements. I wore a simple black dress and carried my custom-ordered bag. I bought it to celebrate selling my first software. I walked to the head table. Before I could say hello, my mother Brenda grabbed my arm hard. She yanked me down into the empty chair next to her and snatched my handbag off the table. She shoved it violently under my chair. I asked her what she was doing. She leaned in close, her voice pure venom. She told me not to bring cheap fakes around these people. She said I was going to humiliate Terrence in front of his new family by looking like a ghetto dropout trying to play dress-up. I did not argue. I smoothed my dress and took a sip of water. I knew fighting with her in public was exactly what she wanted, so she could call me aggressive and unstable. I let her believe my bag was fake because the truth would have ruined her entire reality. A moment later, the bride walked over to our side of the table. Lauren was wearing a stunning white silk gown and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. She always had this way of giving compliments that felt like slaps to the face. She placed a hand on my shoulder and squeezed it tightly. She loudly announced how glad she was that I could make it despite my financial struggles. The table went quiet. Lauren smiled and said she heard I was still doing freelance computer stuff from my apartment. Then she looked back at her wealthy mother, Vivian Sinclair, who was sitting opposite us, observing everything with sharp, calculating eyes. Lauren laughed and told me her father's firm desperately needed a new technology girl to fix their jammed printers. She said she could put in a good word for me so I could finally hold down a steady job. My brother Terrence chuckled into his champagne glass. He did not defend me. He never did. He just nodded and agreed, saying any help I could get would be a blessing for the family. I looked directly at Lauren and thanked her for the offer. I kept my voice perfectly polite and even. I told her I would keep her printer offer in mind if my current projects ever dried up. Vivian Sinclair tilted her head slightly, watching me with an intensity that made the hair on my arms stand up. She did not say a word, but her silence was deafening. My father Warren stood up and clinked his glass to quiet the room. He projected his booming voice across the dining hall. He bragged to the crowd about Terrence's new startup, claiming it was going to revolutionize the digital security industry, calling him the first true visionary of our bloodline. My father announced that he and my mother gladly emptied their life savings to fund Terrence's vision. Then my father made a terrible mistake by taking a shot at me. He looked down at me with pure disgust and added that funding Terrence was a joy unlike watching some people waste family money by dropping out of a perfectly good graduate program just to play around on laptops all day. The guests offered polite, uncomfortable chuckles while my parents beamed with pride. What my father conveniently left out of his speech was the actual truth. I did not drop out of graduate school because I wanted to. I was forced to leave because the money in my college trust fund vanished overnight. My parents had secretly drained my account to bail Terrence out of a massive financial crisis 5 years ago. They sacrificed my future to save his reputation, and then spent the next half-decade calling me a failure for not graduating. I sat there absorbing the public insult. I did not cry. I just watched them perform their lies. Right as my father proudly finished his toast, a sharp, sudden tension rippled through the grand dining room. The head catering manager, looking incredibly pale and sweating profusely, walked quickly toward the head table. He completely bypassed my father and went straight over to Terrence. He leaned down and whispered frantically in my brother's ear. Terrence's previously smug smile vanished instantly. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking physically sick and entirely speechless as he desperately stared at his new bride. The anxious manager spoke just loud enough for all the people sitting at our table to clearly hear. He apologized profusely, but stated that the credit card Terrence provided to cover the $100,000 rehearsal dinner had just been completely declined by the bank. My mother Brenda gasped audibly, clutching her pearls in sheer terror. Across the table, Lauren's billionaire mother, Vivian Sinclair, slowly set down her fork. Vivian raised one highly critical and deeply suspicious eyebrow while staring directly at Terrence. The flawless, wealthy facade my parents had sacrificed my future to build was about to come crashing down in real time. The word declined hung over our table like a heavy, thick fog, suffocating every bit of air in the room. The absolute silence that followed was deafening. The live jazz band playing in the corner seemed to fade out completely as every guest at the head table processed what the catering manager had just announced. Lauren looked like she was going to physically melt into the marble floor. Her pale skin turned a blotchy crimson as she stared at Terrence in sheer horror. Warren. My father moved entirely on instinct, born from years of protecting his perfect image. He immediately grabbed Terrence by the collar of his custom-tailored tuxedo and dragged him roughly toward the back hallway of the country club. I could hear his fierce, panicked whispers slicing through the quiet room as he demanded to know what was going on with the startup money. My mother Brenda did not follow them. Her reaction was directed entirely at me. She lunged across the space between our chairs. Her manicured fingers clamped around my wrist like a vice, her acrylic nails digging so deeply into my skin that a sharp sting shot up my arm. She leaned in close, her face twisted in a frantic, desperate hiss that smelled of expensive Chardonnay and utter terror. She ordered me to pull out my phone right this second. She demanded I call whatever broke friends I had and figure out a way to pull together a loan to cover the $100,000 bill. She actually looked me in the eyes and told me I owed my brother this much after all the shame and disappointment I had brought to their doorstep over the years. She told me to make myself useful for once in my pathetic life and fix the situation before Lauren family realized they were marrying into a fraud. I looked down at her hand gripping my arm. I felt the familiar weight of her emotional abuse trying to push me down into the tiny box she had built for me since childhood. But I was not that scared girl anymore. I gently but forcefully pried her fingers off my wrist one by one. I smoothed out the fabric of my simple black dress and stood up from the table. I did not pull out my phone to beg anyone for money. I turned my back on my mother, leaving her gasping in shock as I walked straight over to the catering manager. The poor man was standing awkwardly near the edge of the dining area, looking anywhere but at our family. He was visibly sweating, holding the little black leather payment booklet like it was a ticking time bomb. I approached him with absolute calm. I opened my clutch and bypassed the standard bank cards. Instead, I pulled out a solid titanium card. It was noticeably heavy and completely matte black. It had no name printed on the front, no bank affiliation, and no standard account numbers. There was only a sleek, minimalist silver wolf, deeply engraved right in the center of the metal. I dropped it onto his silver serving tray. The heavy metal made a sharp, satisfying clink that echoed in the quiet space. I looked the manager directly in the eye and told him to run it for the full amount. I also told him to add a 20% gratuity for his entire staff for having to deal with my family's incredible lack of grace and immense embarrassment this evening. The manager stared at the card, his eyes widening as he registered the weight and the exclusivity of what was sitting on his tray. Before he could take a step toward the payment terminal, heavy footsteps stomped up behind me. Terrence had rushed back from the hallway just in time to see me drop the metal card onto the tray. His initial fear of his declined payment had instantly mutated into vicious defensive arrogance. He let out a loud, mocking scoff that was designed to carry across the room. He pointed a finger at me and demanded to know whose card I had stolen to try and play the hero. He looked at Lauren and her wealthy relatives, making sure they could hear every single word of his performance. He asked if I had finally found some old desperate rich man to fund my sad life, because everyone knew I could not hold down a real job. He crossed his arms and told the entire room that this was classic behavior for me. He loudly proclaimed that I was faking my way through a high society dinner, just like I had faked and cheated my way through all my graduate school exams. He told them I was a fraud who got kicked out and banned from the university campus because I was not smart enough to make it, honestly. He was standing there in his expensive tuxedo, using the exact lie he had fabricated 5 years ago. He was the one who had committed academic fraud. He was the one who had panicked and framed me to cover his own tracks, ensuring he kept his spotless record, while my academic future was completely destroyed. He was holding up that old lie right now like a trophy, using it to humiliate me and distract from his own massive financial failure. My parents had watched him do it back then, and they were watching him do it now, nodding along with his cruel words. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice to argue back. I did not even try to defend my academic record against his vile accusations. I simply stood there with perfect posture, radiating a cold, untouchable peace as the catering manager gingerly picked up the heavy metal card. But before the manager could walk away to run the massive charge, a shadow fell over our section of the room. Vivian Sinclair, Lauren Billionaire mother, was making her way back from the private lounge. She happened to walk directly past the payment counter, just as the manager was holding my titanium card up to the light to inspect it. Vivian stopped dead in her tracks. The poised, aristocratic posture she had maintained all evening completely vanished, her sharp eyes locked onto the matte black metal and that distinct silver wolf logo glaring under the crystal chandeliers. The color completely drained from Vivian's face, leaving her looking as if she had just seen a ghost. She stood frozen, her breathing suddenly shallow. She slowly lifted her gaze from that tiny engraved silver wolf and looked directly into my face, her eyes wide with a sudden terrifying realization of exactly who she was standing in front of. The morning of the wedding arrived with a thick layer of suffocating tension. I stood in the corner of the massive bridal suite at the country club. The room smelled of expensive hairspray and chilled mimosas. A team of makeup artists buzzed around Lauren and her bridesmaids. I was wearing the mandatory pale pink silk robe they had given all of us. I had spent 2 hours that morning carefully styling my natural hair into an elegant updo. I felt beautiful for the first time in days. But as the hired photographer began arranging us for the matching bridal party photos, Lauren held up her hand. She stopped everything and pointed a perfectly manicured finger right at my head. Lauren sighed loudly and told the photographer to pause. She walked over to me with that same condescending smile from the night before. She tilted her head and told me that my hair was just a bit too distracting. She said her wedding had a very specific classic aesthetic, and my natural hair simply did not fit the clean, elegant vision she wanted for her photos. The room went entirely silent. The other bridesmaids, all of them Lauren's wealthy white friends, stared at me through the large vanity mirrors. Nobody said a word. Before I could even respond to the blatant racism, my mother marched across the suite. Brenda did not defend her own daughter. Instead, she grabbed me by the shoulders and forcefully turned me toward the heavy wooden door. She told me I was being entirely selfish by trying to stand out and ruin Lauren's perfect morning. She said I was always trying to make a statement and embarrass the family. I dug my heels into the plush carpet and refused to let her push me out just yet. I looked back at Lauren, intending to tell her exactly what I thought of her classic aesthetic. But the words completely died in my throat when I looked at Lauren's neck. There, resting against Lauren's collarbone, was a heavy vintage pendant. It was a massive, deep blue sapphire surrounded by a halo of antique diamonds. I felt the air leave my lungs. It was my grandmother's necklace, the exact necklace my grandmother wore every single Sunday to church. The exact necklace she had explicitly left to me in her will because I was the only granddaughter who spent time with her before she passed. I stepped away from my mother's grip and pointed at the jewel. My voice shook with a mixture of profound hurt and rising anger. I told Brenda that necklace belonged to me. I reminded her that grandmother specifically wrote my name in the legal trust for that sapphire. My mother did not even have the decency to look ashamed. She walked over to Lauren and lovingly adjusted the clasp of the stolen heirloom. Brenda looked at me with cold, dead eyes. She stated that family heirlooms are for women who actually build family legacies, not for college dropouts and failures. She said Terrence was marrying a Sinclair, and Lauren deserved to wear the family jewels because she was bringing true wealth and status to our bloodline. She told me I had done absolutely nothing with my life to earn the right to wear my grandmother's diamonds. Lauren smiled, touching the sapphire with a manicured finger. She thanked my mother and said it was a lovely welcoming gift to the family. Then she looked at me and sweetly asked if I would mind waiting in the hallway until the important photos were finished. She said I was bringing down the positive energy of the bridal suite. My mother did not wait for my answer. She grabbed my arm again and physically shoved me out into the corridor. She slammed the heavy oak door directly in my face. The loud click of the lock echoed in the empty hallway. I stood there alone on the patterned carpet, wearing a ridiculous pink robe. They had stolen my college fund. They had stolen my grandmother's inheritance. They had stripped away every piece of my dignity to fund this fake billionaire lifestyle for my brother. For a brief second, the familiar weight of being the family scapegoat threatened to crush me. I leaned my head against the cool wallpaper and closed my eyes, trying to slow my breathing. I listened to the muffled sounds of laughter bleeding through the heavy wooden door. They were celebrating my erasure. They were cheering for a man who had built his entire life on my destruction. Then my phone buzzed in the pocket of my robe. I pulled it out and looked at the screen. It was an urgent text message from Marcus, my chief operating officer at Vanguard Shield. Marcus was a brilliant digital forensics expert, and he rarely used the emergency contact line unless the company was under direct attack. I opened the message. The text read that Terrence just submitted his highly anticipated source code to Vivian Sinclair's investment firm for his massive buyout. Terrence was demanding a $500 million acquisition based on his groundbreaking artificial intelligence security software. Marcus wrote that the code was currently compiling on their secure servers for a final audit before the wedding ceremony began. I stared at the screen, waiting for the rest of the message. My phone buzzed again. Marcus sent a second text. He wrote that his team had quietly intercepted the file transfer to run a background check on what Terrence was actually selling to Vivian. Marcus told me to sit down. He wrote that the source code Terrence was claiming as his own genius invention was an exact line-for-line ripoff of our proprietary software. My heart stopped beating for a full second. I read the words over and over again. Terrence had not just stolen my college fund to start his fake company. 5 years ago, when I was kicked out of my house and forced to leave school, Terrence had stolen my old encrypted laptop. He had taken the raw beta code I had been building in my dorm room. He spent the last 5 years repackaging my genuine work and parading it around Atlanta as his own billion-dollar creation. He was selling my software to Lauren's mother for $500 million. I looked back at the locked door of the bridal suite. I could hear them laughing inside, clinking champagne glasses and celebrating their beautiful legacy. A slow, cold smile spread across my face. I typed a single reply to Marcus, instructing him to prepare the digital kill switch. Terrence was about to learn a very hard lesson about stealing from a woman who builds cybersecurity fortresses for a living. The heavy oak door to the groom's suite clicked shut behind me. I turned the brass lock, locking us inside. Terrence was standing in front of a massive gilded mirror, adjusting his custom silk tie. He saw my reflection and let out a long, exasperated sigh. He asked why I was still inside the building when Mother had explicitly told me to wait out of sight. He told me to stop embarrassing the family and go sit in my car until the ceremony was over. I walked further into the room, my heels sinking into the thick carpet. I did not look at the ground. I looked directly into his eyes through the mirror. I told him I'd just received a very interesting message regarding the source code he submitted to Vivian Sinclair firm this morning. I watched his hands freeze on his tie. For a fraction of a second, genuine panic flashed across his perfectly groomed face. But Terrence had spent his entire life being protected from his own consequences. The panic vanished instantly, replaced by his usual suffocating arrogance. He turned around slowly, leaning back against the vanity counter. He asked me what a failed dropout could possibly know about high-level artificial intelligence security protocols. I took another step forward, closing the distance between us. I told him I knew everything about it because it was my code. I listed the specific architecture, the hidden directories, the exact framework I had built in my dorm room 5 years ago. I told him I knew he stole my encrypted laptop the night our parents threw me out of the house. I told him he took my raw beta code, repackaged it, and was now trying to sell it to his future mother-in-law for $500 million. Terrence did not look ashamed. He did not beg for my silence. Instead, he threw his head back and laughed. It was a loud, cruel sound that echoed off the high ceilings of the suite. He poured himself a glass of bourbon from the courtesy bar and took a slow sip. He looked at me with absolute contempt. He asked me, so what if he did? He fully admitted that he took the laptop out of my room while I was packing my bags. He said the code was just sitting there gathering dust while I was busy ruining my academic career. He walked closer to me, the smell of his expensive cologne mixing with the bourbon. He leaned in and asked me who Vivian Sinclair was going to believe. He asked if I honestly thought a billionaire investor would take the word of a bitter, unemployed failure over a celebrated tech prodigy. He reminded me that he had a spotless record, a brilliant reputation, and the absolute backing of our entire family. He told me I was nothing but a ghost they barely acknowledged. I stood my ground, refusing to let his proximity intimidate me. I asked him how he could sleep at night, knowing his entire billionaire lifestyle was built on a foundation of theft. I asked him how he could look our parents in the eye, knowing they drained their retirement savings to fund a fake company. Terrence smirked and swirled the amber liquid in his glass. He shook his head as if pitying my ignorance. He told me I was completely clueless. He said Mom and Dad did not just use their savings to fund his startup. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a vicious whisper. He confessed that they gave him my college fund. He told me that when he needed seed money to secure his first office space, our parents willingly liquidated the trust fund my grandmother had set up for my education. He said they did it because they knew I would never amount to anything anyway. He told me they considered it a smart investment to take money from a lost cause and give it to the golden child. The words hung in the empty air between us. 5 years ago, that confession would have broken me. It would have sent me to the floor sobbing, realizing that my own parents had actively participated in destroying my future just to elevate my brother. But I was not the terrified 20-year-old girl they had kicked to the curb. I was the chief executive officer of Vanguard Shield. I had built an empire from the ashes they left me in. I looked at my brother standing there in his expensive tuxedo, holding a glass of bourbon he paid for with my stolen future. I did not cry. I did not scream. Instead, a warm, genuine smile spread across my face. It was the kind of smile that made Terrence pause. His smug expression faltered slightly as he tried to understand why I was not completely devastated by his cruel confession. I reached into the pocket of my pink silk bridal robe and pulled out my phone. I looked at the dark screen and then back at his confused face. I told him that an artificial intelligence security platform is only as strong as its core architecture. I told him that when you steal someone else's house, you should always make sure they did not keep a master key to the front door. Terrence scoffed again, calling me delusional. He pointed to his presentation laptop sitting open on the large mahogany desk across the room. He proudly stated that his software was currently running its final diagnostic compilation on Vivian Sinclair's secure servers, and there was absolutely nothing I could do to stop his buyout. I kept smiling. I told him we should see if his stolen code actually compiles for his big presentation. I unlocked my phone and opened the secure application my chief operating officer had just prepared for me. I did not hesitate. I pressed a single key on my screen. The reaction was instantaneous. Across the room, Terrence's presentation laptop emitted a harsh, piercing alarm. The sleek interface he had been so proud of vanished. The screen flashed violently before turning a bright, blinding red. A massive critical error warning covered the entire display, blaring loudly through the quiet suite. Terrence dropped his bourbon glass. It shattered against the floor, sending amber liquid and crystal shards everywhere. He lunged toward the desk, his hands frantically slamming against the keyboard, trying to clear the red screen, but the system was completely locked out. I left Terrence practically crawling on the floor, frantically hitting keys on his dead laptop. The ceremony itself was a blur of expensive flowers and fake smiles. Terrence sweated through his vows, his eyes darting around the room in absolute panic while my parents wept tears of joy. But the real show began when the doors opened to the grand reception ballroom. The country club had been transformed into a ridiculous display of forced wealth and desperate social climbing. Thousands of white orchids dripped from the crystal chandeliers, and waiters in crisp white coats carried silver trays of expensive champagne. I walked into the massive room and made my way over to the gilded seating chart displayed on an ornate wooden easel near the entrance. I traced my finger down the alphabetical list of prestigious guests. My name was not listed with my parents. It was not listed with my brother or the extended family. It was written in tiny print at the very bottom corner, assigning me to table 42. I looked across the sprawling room, trying to find my assigned seat. Lauren's snobby sister Victoria deliberately bumped my shoulder as she walked past, holding a glass of wine. Victoria wore a sleek emerald gown and a smile full of pure malice. She told me she had to make a few last-minute adjustments to the seating chart to ensure the truly important guests had the best views of the dance floor. She pointed a manicured finger toward the far back corner of the room. I followed her gaze. Table 42 was not even a real banquet table. It was a flimsy metal folding table covered with a cheap white linen cloth that barely hid the rusted legs. It was shoved directly next to the swinging metal doors of the kitchen, where waiters were constantly rushing in and out with heavy trays of hot food. Worse, it was pushed right up against the massive black speakers of the DJ booth. The bass from the music was already vibrating the water in the glasses. Victoria smiled sweetly and told me she knew I would not mind, since I was so used to being in the background of my brother's successful life anyway. She sashayed away to join the rest of the bridal party at their elevated velvet-draped table. I calmly walked over to my folding chair and sat down facing the room. I did not complain. I did not cause a scene. I just sat quietly and watched the room full of elite guests. A few minutes later, my mother Brenda strolled past my table, leading a group of wealthy elderly women from our church congregation. Brenda saw me sitting by the kitchen doors and let out a loud theatrical sigh, making sure her voice carried over the ambient music. She apologized profusely to her church friends for my placement, claiming I simply lacked the social grace required to sit with civilized guests. She told them I was always acting out and trying to draw negative attention to the family, so they had to put me in the back corner to protect Terrence and his special night. The church ladies shook their heads in collective pity, whispering about how incredibly hard it must be for a good Christian mother to raise such a rebellious and ungrateful failure. I picked up my fork and took a bite of my salad, perfectly content in my exile. I knew exactly what was ticking down on the secure servers at Vivian Sinclair investment firm. The lights in the ballroom slowly dimmed and a bright spotlight hit the center of the polished dance floor. My father Warren eagerly grabbed the microphone from the DJ stand right next to my table. He tapped the microphone twice and cleared his throat, commanding the attention of the massive room. He puffed out his chest, looking out at the sea of wealthy country club guests and elite investors. He started his toast by praising his new daughter-in-law and thanking the Sinclair family for bringing their beautiful legacy into our lives. Then he turned his attention to his golden child. My father spoke with overwhelming pride that bordered on worship. He declared to the entire ballroom that Terrence was the first true genius of our bloodline. He told the room that our family had waited generations for someone with Terrence's brilliant mind and unmatched work ethic. He painted a picture of Terrence staying up late into the night writing complex code and building his technology company from scratch, using nothing but his own sweat and intellect. He completely erased my existence from the family history. He stood in front of hundreds of people and proudly rewrote reality, making Terrence the sole inheritor of all intelligence and ambition, while deliberately ignoring the daughter whose future he had stolen to pay for this very moment. The crowd erupted into polite applause. Terence sat at the head table, wiping profuse sweat from his forehead, looking entirely nauseous and terrified. As the applause died down and the DJ prepared to start the music for the first dance, Vivian Sinclair slowly stood up from her seat at the center of the head table. She did not applaud. Her face was carved from absolute stone. She had been staring down at her phone for the last 10 minutes, reading urgent messages that I knew were coming directly from her own digital forensics team. Vivian raised her hand and gave a sharp, silent signal to the two massive men in dark suits standing near the main exits. Her private security detail moved immediately. One of the men walked straight over to the DJ booth right next to my folding table and physically pulled the main audio cable from the soundboard. The music died instantly. A heavy, confused silence slammed into the ballroom. Warren, still standing alone on the dance floor, lowered his microphone, looking around in sheer confusion. Vivian stepped around the head table, her high heels echoing sharply on the marble floor. Her voice cut through the massive room, cold and commanding, without even needing a microphone to amplify her words. She looked directly at Warren and then shifted her piercing gaze to Terence, who looked like he was about to pass out. She stated clearly that before anyone took another sip of champagne or celebrated this supposed family genius, she needed to speak directly to the person who actually built this technology. The silence in the massive ballroom was absolute and terrifying. The echo of Vivian Sinclair demanding to speak to the real creator of the technology hung over the crowd like a guillotine waiting to drop. My father Warren stood frozen on the dance floor, his hands still gripping the microphone, his mouth slightly open in complete confusion. At the head table, Terence looked as though all the air had been violently sucked from his lungs. He nervously adjusted his custom silk tie and let out a forced, hollow chuckle. He clearly thought Vivian was making some sort of eccentric joke, or perhaps setting up a dramatic introduction for his team of developers. But Vivian was not looking at Terence. She was not looking at Lauren or my father. Her sharp, penetrating gaze bypassed the elevated head table entirely and sliced right through the sea of hundreds of wealthy guests. She was looking directly at the dark back corner of the room, straight at the cheap metal folding table by the swinging kitchen doors. Terence followed her gaze, and the realization hit him like a physical blow. Real panic finally set in, taking over his perfectly groomed features. His jaw clenched so tight a muscle ticked in his cheek. He desperately needed to maintain control of the narrative before his entire fake empire collapsed. He stepped off the raised platform of the head table and marched across the polished marble floor. He pushed past the tables of confused elite investors and country club members, marching straight toward my dark corner. His heavy footsteps were the only sound in the suffocatingly quiet room. He reached my table and did not hesitate. Terence grabbed me by the arm, his grip tight and punishing, his fingers digging into my skin. He leaned in and hissed under his breath, demanding that I stop whatever pathetic stunt I was pulling. I did not resist his grip. I stood up smoothly, smoothing down the fabric of my pale pink bridesmaid robe. I walked with perfect posture, letting him physically drag me out from the shadows and into the center of the brilliantly lit dance floor. I wanted every single person in the room to have a clear view of what was about to happen. Terence pulled me to a stop just a few feet away from where Vivian was standing. He forced a bright, charming smirk onto his face, plastering on his fake salesman persona for the crowd. He gestured toward me as if I were a piece of trash that had accidentally blown into the grand ballroom. He looked at Vivian and confidently stated that there must be some sort of misunderstanding. He announced to the silent room that this was Alana, our family failure. He asked Vivian to please excuse my disruptive presence, claiming I had a sad history of seeking desperate attention because I could not achieve anything on my own. Before Vivian could even respond, my mother, Brenda, stepped forward from her front row table. Brenda was desperate to preserve the illusion of her perfect family for her wealthy church friends and the billionaire Sinclair matriarch. She smoothed down her expensive evening gown and let out a high-pitched, nervous laugh. She loudly told Vivian and the entire ballroom that our family absolutely never brags about me, because I was a college dropout who simply refused to make anything of myself. Brenda apologized profusely for my absolute lack of grace and eagerly offered to have the country club security team escort me out immediately so the beautiful celebration could continue without further embarrassment. Vivian Sinclair did not even blink at my mother. She completely ignored Brenda's frantic apologies and Terrence's arrogant smirk. The billionaire businesswoman slowly walked toward me, her heels echoing sharply on the marble. She stopped just inches away, completely invading my personal space. Vivian looked me up and down, taking in my simple pink robe and the fact that I had just been dragged from a folding chair near the kitchen. Then she looked directly into my eyes. The coldness in her expression melted away into profound realization. She spoke quietly, but the absolute silence of the room carried her voice to every single guest. She said, "So it is you." She told me she recognized my work. The crowd erupted into a low, confused murmur. My father stepped forward, his face red with embarrassment, trying to interject and save his golden son. But Vivian held up a single hand, silencing Warren instantly. Vivian turned slightly to address the massive room, her voice echoing with undeniable authority. She explained to the crowd that for the past 2 years, her massive investment firm had been aggressively trying to track down and acquire an elite shadow cybersecurity firm known in the underground tech industry as Vanguard Shield. She described the company as an untouchable fortress of digital architecture built by an anonymous genius who had completely revolutionized artificial intelligence security protocols. She stated that her team had spent millions of dollars just trying to secure a single meeting with the elusive chief executive officer of Vanguard Shield, but the creator had remained completely hidden from the public eye. Terrence let go of my arm as if his hand had just been burned. The blood completely drained from his face, leaving him looking sickly and pale under the bright spotlight. He began to stammer, stepping forward and desperately trying to interrupt. He claimed that Vanguard Shield was nothing but an internet myth, and that his software was the only real viable product on the market today. Vivian turned her gaze back to Terrence. She reached into the pocket of her tailored evening jacket and pulled out a small, sleek silver flash drive. It was the exact drive Terrence had proudly handed her that morning, containing his supposedly groundbreaking lifework. She held the drive up high so the light from the crystal chandeliers caught the reflection of the metal. She looked at Terrence with a gaze that could freeze boiling water. She told him that her digital forensics team had just finished tearing apart every single line of code on that drive while the wedding ceremony was taking place. She looked at him in front of his new bride, his proud parents, and hundreds of elite guests who had just applauded his genius. Vivian's voice rang out crystal clear and devastatingly final. She held up the flash drive and told Terrence that he did not build a single piece of this technology. She stated that the source code on the drive contained a highly encrypted digital watermark buried deep within the core architecture. She paused, letting the crushing weight of her words settle over the stunned crowd. Then she turned her eyes back to me and announced that the undeniable digital watermark belonged exclusively to the chief executive officer of Vanguard Shield. The absolute silence that followed Vivian Sinclair's declaration lasted for exactly 3 agonizing seconds before the entire ballroom erupted into utter chaos. It was as if a bomb had been dropped directly onto the polished marble dance floor. The polite whispers of the country club elite mutated into a deafening roar of shocked gasps and frantic murmurs. At the head table, the illusion of the perfect billionaire merger completely disintegrated in real time. Lauren dropped her crystal champagne flute. It shattered against the edge of the table, but the sound was entirely drowned out by her piercing shriek. She spun around to face Terrence, her perfectly applied bridal makeup twisting into a mask of pure, unfiltered panic and rage. She grabbed him by the lapels of his custom tuxedo, screaming at the top of her lungs, demanding to know what Vivian was talking about. She shook his shoulders frantically, demanding to know if he was a fraud, and if he had just humiliated her in front of half the city and all of her wealthy relatives. Terrence could not even form a coherent sentence. He was sweating profusely, his eyes darting wildly around the room, looking for an escape route that simply did not exist. He raised his hands in a pathetic attempt to calm Lauren down, sputtering completely meaningless syllables about misunderstandings and corporate espionage and jealous competitors. He tried to physically pull away from her grip, but she held on screaming right into his face. But nobody in the crowd was looking at Terrence anymore. Every single eye in the massive ballroom was locked directly on me, standing calmly near the kitchen doors. Warren and Brenda were frozen on the dance floor for a brief moment, their brains violently struggling to process the catastrophic destruction of their golden child. But the reality of the situation quickly sank in, and their survival instincts took over. Instead of feeling shame or turning their anger toward the son who had just been exposed as a massive fraud, they did exactly what they had done for my entire life. They blamed me. Warren's face turned a dangerous shade of violently dark red. The veins in his neck bulged against his tight collar as he stomped across the dance floor, charging directly at me like a wounded animal. He pointed a trembling, furious finger at my face, screaming over the noise of the frantic crowd. He violently accused me of hacking into Terrence's secure servers out of pure jealousy. He yelled that I was a psychotic failure who had spent the last 5 years planning to sabotage my own brother, just because I could not handle my own miserable mediocrity. He told the horrified wealthy guests that I was a malicious hacker trying to ruin a beautiful wedding out of sheer bitter spite, and that I needed to be arrested immediately. Brenda was right behind him, but she did not bother with empty words or accusations. She pushed past the remaining distance between us, her eyes wide with a frantic, desperate fury that I had never seen before. She raised her hand high into the air and brought it down across my face with every ounce of strength she possessed. The slap echoed through our corner of the room with a sharp, sickening crack that cut through the ambient noise of the panicking crowd. My head snapped violently to the side from the sheer force of the impact. The sudden strike sent a shockwave of burning pain across my cheek, and a hot metallic taste of copper immediately flooded the inside of my mouth, where my teeth had caught my lower lip. Brenda stood there breathing heavily, her chest heaving as she stared at me with absolute unmasked loathing. She screamed that I was a malicious brat. Her voice was shrill and cracking with genuine hatred as she yelled that I had ruined absolutely everything since the day I was born. She told me I was a disease on this family, and that I belonged in the gutter where they had left me. I slowly turned my head back to face her. I felt the warm trickle of blood pooling in the corner of my mouth and running down my chin. My cheek was burning, radiating a bright, angry heat, but I did not reach up to touch it. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I did not let a single tear form in my eyes. I just looked at the woman who was supposed to protect me and let out a soft, cold laugh. I looked right through her frantic, desperate facade and smiled warmly. The sight of me smiling with blood on my teeth made Brenda physically recoil in genuine terror. I wiped the small drop of blood from my lip with the back of my hand and slowly turned my gaze away from my violent parents. I looked over their shoulders toward the back corner of the room, directly at the raised platform of the DJ booth. The young man standing behind the massive audio deck had been watching the entire scene unfold with wide, terrified eyes. I had found him during the cocktail hour earlier that evening and handed him a very thick envelope of cash, along with a single encrypted flash drive and a very specific set of instructions. I met his gaze through the chaotic crowd and gave him a single sharp nod. The DJ did not hesitate. He slammed his hand down on the master control switch, bypassing the country club's standard audio-visual system entirely. The heavy mechanical gears hidden in the ceiling above the head table groaned loudly to life. The massive white silk drapery behind the 5-tier wedding cake suddenly retracted, pulling away to reveal the bare wall. Behind the fabric, 2 enormous high-definition projection screens descended rapidly from the rafters. The screens flickered to life, casting a bright, blinding blue light over the darkened ballroom. The entire room went dead silent again as hundreds of faces turned upward to look at the massive digital displays looming over the bridal party. Across the gigantic screens, endless lines of complex source code began to scroll at a dizzying, impossible speed. It was the exact code Terrence had tried to sell to Vivian Sinclair. It was the digital architecture he claimed to have built from scratch with his own genius mind. The green and white text, reflected in the wide eyes of the silent guests. But as the scrolling code reached its final sequence, the screen froze completely. The background turned a deep matte black. A massive, undeniable digital watermark burned onto the center of both screens in glowing white block letters. The text was impossible to ignore or explain away. It loomed over Terrence's head like a glowing digital gravestone, marking the permanent death of his stolen empire. The giant letters flashed rhythmically for every single guest, every elite investor, and Vivian Sinclair to read loud and clear. It read, "Property of Vanguard Shield, Chief Executive Officer, Alana." The giant glowing letters reflected off the crystal glasses and the terrified faces of the wedding guests. Nobody could breathe. The digital watermark hung in the air, proving without a single shadow of a doubt that I was the creator of the technology Terrence had just tried to sell for billions of dollars. The sheer magnitude of the lie settled over the room. Terrence physically stumbled backward, bumping into the head table and knocking over a towering floral arrangement. It crashed to the floor, spraying water and white orchids everywhere, but nobody even looked at the mess. They were all staring at the screen and then staring directly at me. I stood perfectly still, wiping the last trace of blood from my chin. The silence was suddenly shattered by a sound that did not even seem human. It was a guttural, furious shriek that ripped from the throat of the beautiful bride. Lauren stood at the edge of the dance floor, her hands balled into tight fists. Her perfectly styled hair was beginning to unravel, and the sweet, innocent bridal facade she had worn all day completely melted away. It was replaced by a twisted mask of pure, vicious elitism. She stomped her expensive designer heels against the marble and pointed a manicured finger directly at my face. She did not care about the lie Terrence had told. She only cared about the money that was suddenly slipping through her fingers. Lauren began to scream at me, her voice echoing off the high vaulted ceilings. She called me a pathetic ghetto dropout who was trying to extort her new husband. She yelled that I was nothing but a jealous little nobody who wanted to ruin a high society wedding because I could not afford to be part of their world. She paced back and forth, dragging the train of her expensive silk gown through the puddle of spilled flower water, completely ruining the fabric. She glared at me with absolute disgust, telling the room that people like me should not even be allowed inside the country club, let alone be claiming ownership of a billion-dollar tech firm. When I simply stood there staring at her with a blank expression, Lauren spun around to face her mother. She marched right up to Vivian Sinclair and began issuing demands like a spoiled toddler throwing a tantrum. Lauren screamed at Vivian to just fix the problem right now. She demanded that her billionaire mother pull out her checkbook and just buy out the little ghetto dropout. Lauren yelled that Vivian had endless amounts of money, and she could simply pay me off to go away so Terrence could keep the credit, and their glorious initial public offering could move forward as planned. She told Vivian that throwing a few $1,000,000 at a desperate loser like me would make the entire nightmare disappear and protect their social standing. Vivian Sinclair did not reach for her checkbook. She stood perfectly straight, her face carved from absolute ice. She looked at her daughter with an expression of profound disgust. Vivian spoke, her voice deadly calm, but loud enough for every single investor and country club member to hear. She told Lauren that she was an absolute disgrace to the Sinclair family name. Vivian stated publicly that she had spent her entire life building an empire based on genuine innovation and strict integrity, and she would absolutely never use her wealth to fund a stolen project or protect a pathetic fraud. She looked Lauren up and down and announced that she was deeply ashamed to see her own daughter acting like a greedy, entitled brat who valued a fake social image over actual talent. Vivian completely disowned Lauren's behavior right there on the dance floor, telling the entire ballroom that the Sinclair investment firm was officially pulling every single cent of funding from Terrence's company. The words hit Lauren like a physical blow. The realization that the billions of dollars were instantly gone washed over her face. The massive mansion, the private jets, the elite social status. It all vanished in the blink of an eye. Lauren slowly turned her head to look at Terrence, who was still cowering near the broken flowers. All the manufactured love and bridal adoration disappeared from her eyes, leaving nothing but toxic resentment. She lunged at him, shoving him hard in the chest with both hands. Lauren screamed right into Terrence's face, asking him how he could be so incredibly stupid. She did not care that he was humiliated, she only cared that he was broke. She violently shoved him again, her voice breaking as she screamed that she only married him because of the upcoming initial public offering. She announced to the silent room that she never loved him, and that she only put up with his boring personality and his pathetic, desperate family because he promised her a billionaire lifestyle. She called him a useless broke fraud and a pathetic liar who could not even steal a piece of software correctly. Lauren ripped the expensive diamond tiara and veil from her head and threw them directly at Terrence's face, screaming that she wanted an annulment immediately. Terrence caught the veil as it hit his chest. His eyes were wide and completely unhinged. He looked at his screaming bride and then at his horrified parents, who were still standing frozen near the edge of the dance floor. His entire manufactured life was burning to the ground in front of him. The genius reputation, the massive wealth, the beautiful wife. It was all gone. His mind simply snapped. The pressure of the lie completely broke him. He dropped the veil and turned his head slowly toward me. The look in his eyes was no longer panic. It was pure, unadulterated hatred. He let out a low, animalistic growl and lunged toward the nearest banquet table. The wealthy guests shrieked and scrambled backward, knocking over their chairs to get out of his way. Terrence grabbed the heavy white linen tablecloth and ripped it aside, sending crystal glasses and fine china crashing to the floor. His hand closed around a heavy serrated steak knife that had been sitting near a dinner plate. He gripped the wooden handle so tightly his knuckles turned entirely white. Before anyone could even process what was happening, Terrence charged across the room directly at me. I backed up instinctively, but my shoulders hit the hard edge of the massive black speakers belonging to the DJ booth. I was completely boxed into the dark corner. Terrence closed the distance between us in seconds, raising the heavy steak knife, pointing the jagged silver blade directly at my chest. He was breathing heavily, sweat pouring down his face, his eyes wide and frantic. He ordered me to open my laptop right this second. He screamed that I was going to log into the Vanguard Shieldmaster server and completely transfer all the ownership rights directly to his name. He yelled that I owed him this company, and he was not going to let a worthless failure of a sister ruin his entire life. The crowd erupted into absolute pandemonium. People were screaming and running toward the main exit doors, desperate to escape the armed madman. Brenda and Warren were shouting Terrence's name, but they were too terrified to actually step forward and stop their golden child. I stared at the sharp edge of the blade, trembling just inches from my heart. I did not move a single muscle. Suddenly, the heavy metallic sound of weapons being drawn echoed sharply through the chaotic room. Vivian private security team had moved with terrifying speed. Two massive men in dark suits stepped forward, forming a protective semicircle around Vivian, while three other highly trained guards unholstered their black firearms and aimed them directly at Terrence's head, shouting for him to drop the knife immediately. The heavy black firearms were pointed directly at Terrence's sweating forehead. Before the guards could even take another step forward, my father threw his entire body across the dance floor. Warren placed himself directly between the private security team and his precious golden child, holding his hands high in the air. He was frantically begging the armed men not to shoot, claiming that Terrence was just overwhelmed and confused by the stress of the wedding. The ballroom was a chaotic chorus of terrified screams and shattering glass as elite guests trampled over each other, trying to escape the madness. Warren knew the local police would be arriving at any second, and his family was about to be utterly destroyed in front of the most powerful people in the city. He turned his panicked eyes away from the security team and stared directly at me. He knew I was the only person on Earth who could stop the bleeding and give Terrence the technology that would save his pathetic life. Warren lunged at me with a terrifying speed. He grabbed my arm with a vicious grip so tight that it bruised my skin instantly. He yanked me away from the black speakers and dragged me forcefully through the chaotic crowd of fleeing guests. I did not fight him because I wanted to see exactly how far my father was willing to go to protect a massive fraud. He pulled me down a short, carpeted hallway just off the main ballroom, away from Vivian and the armed guards. He shoved me roughly through the heavy oak door of the private bridal preparation suite. He slammed the heavy door shut behind us and quickly locked the brass deadbolt. The muffled sounds of the panicking crowd and the shouting security guards were instantly cut off, leaving us in a suffocatingly tense silence. The suite was a mess of discarded white tulle empty champagne flutes and spilled makeup from Lauren getting ready earlier that day. Warren backed me forcefully into a brightly lit mirrored vanity table. He was breathing heavily, his face pale and completely covered in a thick layer of cold sweat. He pointed a trembling finger directly at my face, dropping all pretenses of being a loving father or a respectable church leader. He demanded that I pull out my phone log into the Vanguard Shield master server and transfer full ownership rights to Terrence immediately. He told me that I owed this family for keeping a roof over my head for all those years, and that I was not going to destroy my brother. Brilliant future just because I wanted to throw a petty little tantrum. I just stared at him, my face completely blank and completely devoid of any emotion. I told him that Vanguard Shield was worth over $2 billion and that I would rather burn it to the completely ground than give Terrence a single line of my custom code. My father's eyes darkened with a vicious, desperate cruelty that I had never seen before. He leaned in so close I could smell the expensive scotch on his breath and see the broken blood vessels in his angry eyes. He told me that if I did not sign the tech company over to Terrence right now, he would completely ruin my life forever. Warren smiled a nasty, bitter smile and brought up the $50,000 that had gone missing from the church offering fund 5 years ago. He reminded me of the terrible, devastating scandal that had rocked our local congregation when the charity money mysteriously vanished from the locked safe. He told me that he would walk right back out into that ballroom and announce to the church elders and the arriving police that he had finally found the thief. He threatened to tell the entire world that his troubled dropout daughter had stolen the church money to fund her pathetic little computer projects. He promised me that he would ensure I went to federal prison for theft and fraud unless I gave Terrence the company immediately. I stood perfectly still, leaning against the vanity as the pieces of a 5-year-old puzzle finally snapped into place. 5 years ago, Terrence had been drowning in massive debt from his failed startup attempts and his expensive lifestyle. My parents had claimed they remortgaged their house to bail him out, but the timeline never made any sense to me. The money had vanished from the church safe during the exact same week. Terrence suddenly paid off all of his aggressive creditors and bought a new sports car. I looked at Warren and the absolute sickening truth washed over me. I did not steal that money. Terrence stole the $50,000 from the church offering, and Warren knew it the entire time. My father had actively covered up a felony committed by his precious son, while letting the congregation tear themselves apart looking for a culprit. I looked directly into Warren's eyes and stated that he had framed his own daughter to protect a thief. I asked him how he could possibly look at himself in the mirror, knowing he was willing to throw me in a prison cell just so his son would not have to face the consequences of stealing from their own community. Warren slammed his fist down hard on the mirrored vanity, shattering a crystal perfume bottle into a dozen jagged pieces. He did not even try to deny my accusation. He sneered at me, his face twisted with absolute unmasked disgust. He proudly admitted that he protected Terrence because Terrence actually had a real future. He yelled that Terrence was going to be a visionary and a billionaire, and that he could not let a silly little mistake ruin the destiny of the family genius. Warren looked me up and down with pure toxic contempt and shouted that I had no future anyway. He told me I was just a background character in my brother's successful life, and that framing me was the easiest decision he had ever made because nobody would ever believe a worthless dropout over a beloved church leader and his successful son. He stepped closer, raising his hand as if he was going to strike me across the face, just like my mother had done moments ago. He demanded that I sign the server papers right now, or he would make sure I never saw the light of day again. I did not flinch, and I did not back away from his raised hand. I slowly reached my hand deep into the silk pocket of my pale pink bridesmaid robe. I pulled out a small black wireless microphone. It was the backup mic I had taken from the DJ booth when I tipped the young man and handed over the flash drive. The green indicator light on the side of the microphone was blinking steadily, showing that the audio feed was completely live and directly connected to the massive concert speakers out in the main ballroom. I raised the small black microphone to my lips, my eyes locked dead onto my father's suddenly terrified face. The color drained from his cheeks as he realized what he was looking at. I spoke softly but clearly into the device, asking if every single person, the police and the church elders out in the ballroom, heard that entire confession clearly. The response was instantaneous and absolutely beautiful. Through the heavy oak door of the bridal suite, we heard the deafening collective gasp of hundreds of people, followed immediately by the furious shouting of the church elders, demanding that the security guards break down the door. I did not wait for the security team to break the heavy oak door off its hinges. I calmly reached past my frozen father and twisted the brass deadbolt. The door swung open to reveal a solid wall of furious faces. The private security guards immediately lowered their weapons, seeing that I was completely unharmed, but the church elders pushed past them. They were men who had known my father for decades. They were men who had trusted him to lead their congregation and guide their community with absolute moral authority. They stared at Warren with a level of sheer absolute disgust that made him physically shrink backward into the ruined bridal suite. The head elder, a stern man named Abraham, stepped forward, his voice trembling with righteous anger. He looked Warren directly in the eye and told him that he was officially stripped of all his titles within the church, effective immediately. Abraham stated that the police had already been called and were waiting outside to take him into custody for questioning regarding the stolen $50,000. Warren collapsed against the shattered, mirrored vanity, burying his face in his trembling hands. He let out a pathetic, whimpering sob as his entire respectable life completely evaporated into thin air. He had sacrificed his own daughter to protect a fraud, and now he was going to lose his freedom and his legacy for it. I walked past the ruined man and stepped back out onto the main dance floor. The crowd of wealthy guests parted for me like the Red Sea. Nobody dared to speak or stand in my way. Brenda was standing near the overturned floral arrangements, watching her husband being cornered by the furious church elders. She looked around the massive ballroom and realized in a single terrifying second that her precious social standing was completely annihilated. The country club elite were whispering and pointing at her with absolute unmasked contempt. The billionaire investors she had tried to impress were looking at her family like they were a disease. The elderly churchwomen who had pitied me earlier were now staring at Brenda with pure judgment. Brenda desperately needed a distraction. She needed to shift the narrative and gain immediate sympathy from the wealthy crowd to save herself. She dramatically gasped loudly enough for the entire ballroom to hear. She clutched her manicured hands over the chest of her expensive emerald evening gown and began to stagger backward. She let out a pathetic, breathy cry and slowly collapsed onto the cold marble floor. She fluttered her eyelids and gasped for air, making sure her dress did not wrinkle as she claimed her heart was failing from the overwhelming shock of my vicious lies. Several guests rushed forward out of basic human instinct, but I simply rolled my eyes and stepped right over her prone body. I looked down at her theatrical performance and spoke in a clear, carrying voice that echoed across the silent room. I told her to stop faking it right this second. I told the entire crowd that my mother was perfectly healthy and just putting on a desperate, pathetic show to avoid accountability for destroying my life. I looked right at Brenda and stated that she had pulled the exact same fake heart attack stunt to get out of attending my high school graduation. I explained to the horrified guests that she had faked a medical emergency just because she wanted to go on a luxury Caribbean cruise with her wealthy friends instead of spending a single afternoon celebrating my academic achievements. The guests who had rushed to help her suddenly froze in their tracks. They looked at her perfectly applied makeup and her steady breathing and realized they were being played by a master manipulator. They backed away from her in absolute disgust, leaving Brenda lying completely alone on the cold marble floor, looking like a desperate fool. Terence was still surrounded by Vivian armed guards, but the heavy black weapons were lowered now that the immediate threat of the steak knife was gone. He was completely unhinged. He was sweating profusely, staining his custom silk shirt and ruining his expensive tuxedo. He was shaking violently with a volatile mixture of terror and furious, arrogant rage. He looked around the ballroom and realized he was losing absolutely everything. His beautiful bride had demanded an annulment and called him a broke fraud. His billionaire investors were pulling their funding. His stolen artificial intelligence company was exposed as a massive lie. But his massive inflated ego simply could not accept total defeat. He glared at me, his eyes bloodshot and wild with desperate delusion. He screamed across the silent ballroom that I had not won anything yet. He shouted that he still had the massive family estate in his name, and that the sprawling property was worth millions of dollars. He wildly declared that he was going to mortgage the entire estate again, first thing in the morning. He screamed that he would use every single cent of that money to hire the most ruthless corporate lawyers in the country. He promised to drag me through endless, expensive litigation and completely ruin me in federal court until I begged him on my knees to take the Vanguard Shield algorithms back. I stood perfectly calm under the bright, blinding glare of the massive projection screens. The giant, glowing white letters of my digital watermark were still flashing behind me, proving to the world exactly who I was. I listened to his desperate screaming rant and slowly unclasped my designer handbag. I reached inside the soft leather interior and pulled out a thick stack of heavy legal documents. The papers were bound by a crisp blue ribbon and stamped with official county seals. I held the thick legal deed up high so the bright lights of the crystal chandeliers caught the reflection of the gold notary stamps across the front pages. I looked at Terrence's terrified, sweating face and told him that he was not going to mortgage anything ever again. The heavy parchment paper felt solid and powerful in my hand as I stepped away from the corner and walked right into the center of the ruined dance floor. The remaining guests held their breath, watching as I held the documents out for everyone to see. Terrence's face drained of all color, turning a sickly shade of gray. He recognized the blue ribbon and the thick binding immediately. I looked directly at my father, who was still slumped against the shattered vanity table in the bridal suite, his eyes wide with a new kind of panic. I told Warren that his golden boy had been keeping a massive secret from him for a very long time. I explained to the silent ballroom exactly how Terrence had managed to fund his sudden extravagant lifestyle. When he met Lauren, he desperately needed cash to keep up the illusion of being a wealthy tech genius. He needed money for the luxury sports cars, the bespoke designer suits, and the lavish dinners at exclusive country clubs to impress Vivian. So instead of actually working or building a real company, Terrence took the easy way out, just like he always did. I looked at Warren and told him that his precious son had secretly taken out a massive illegal loan against the family multi-million-dollar Atlanta estate. Warren pushed himself off the broken glass of the vanity and stumbled forward, his legs shaking violently. He reached out with trembling hands and snatched the deed from my grip. His eyes darted frantically across the legal text, scanning the loan agreements, the massive borrowing amounts, and the official bank seals. Then his eyes landed on the signature line at the very bottom of the final page. Warren let out a sound that was half gasp and half sob. He stared at the perfectly forged signature in absolute horror. He looked up at Terrence, who was now physically cowering behind one of the armed security guards trying to hide from his own father. Warren's voice broke completely as he asked the question, the words tumbling out of his mouth in a fragile, devastated whisper. He asked Terrence if he really stole his house. He asked his golden child, the son he had lied for, the son he had framed me for, the son he had sacrificed his entire reputation and church career to protect, if he had forged his signature and stolen the only true asset the family had left. Terence could not even look his father in the eye. He stared at the floor, his shoulders shaking silently, admitting his guilt without saying a single word. The ultimate betrayal hung heavy in the air, proving that the golden boy cared for no one but himself. Brenda let out a horrifying wail from her spot on the marble floor. Her fake heart attack was entirely forgotten as the reality of absolute financial ruin crashed down on her head. The Atlanta estate was her prized possession, her ultimate status symbol. It was the house where she hosted her elite charity galas, her garden parties, and her high society luncheons. The thought of losing her sprawling mansion was a fate worse than death for a woman who only cared about appearances. She scrambled to her feet, her emerald gown stained with water, and smashed cake icing, grabbing Warren's arm and begging him to tell her it was a mistake. She screamed that Terence would never do something so reckless to his own mother. I looked at my parents, watching their entire carefully constructed world burn to ash, and I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, deep sense of peace. I took a slow, deliberate step toward them and delivered the final blow. I told my father that Terence did not just steal the house. I explained that because Terence was too busy buying diamond tiaras for a bride who despised him, he had never made a single payment on that massive illegal loan. The interest had compounded, the late penalties had piled up into the hundreds of thousands, and the bank had quietly foreclosed on the property a full year ago. The ballroom erupted into shocked murmurs. Brenda's legs gave out again, and she collapsed against Warren, who was too stunned to even hold her up. Warren shook his head in absolute denial, whispering that the bank had never contacted them, that they had never received a single foreclosure notice or warning. I smiled a cold, bitter smile and told him that Terence had simply intercepted all the mail, changing the contact addresses and the phone numbers on the account, so his parents would remain completely in the dark while they happily slept in a house they no longer legally owned. They had been living as squatters for 12 entire months, but I was not finished. I reached back into my designer bag and pulled out one final piece of paper. It was a single crisp white sheet, folded perfectly in thirds. I held it up between two fingers, letting the silence stretch out until you could hear a pin drop in the massive room. I looked at my parents and told them that when the bank put the foreclosed debt up for private auction last month, I had an anonymous holding company swoop in and purchase it in full. I told them that I was the one who bought their debt. I owned the estate. I owned the walls, the swimming pool, the manicured gardens, and the roof over their heads. I walked slowly over to the center of the room, where the towering 5-tier wedding cake had been partially smashed during Terrence's frantic rush for the steak knife. I held the white piece of paper over the ruined, sugary mess. I looked directly into my mother, terrified, tear-streaked eyes, and told her that her time living rent-free in my house was officially over. I let go of the paper, watching it flutter down and land softly onto the ruined wedding cake, sinking slightly into the white frosting. I told them it was their formal 30-day eviction notice and suggested they start packing their bags immediately because I was going to bulldoze the entire property the second they moved out. The heavy silence in the room was finally broken by a sharp, bitter laugh. Lauren stepped over the messy white frosting and the damp eviction notice, completely ignoring the destruction around her. She did not look sad or heartbroken. She looked absolutely lethal. She reached down to her left hand and violently yanked the massive diamond engagement ring off her finger. The ring that Terence had bought using the stolen money from my company and the illegal loan against my parents' house. She looked at Terence, who was still cowering on the floor, trembling and sweating, and she threw the heavy diamond ring directly at his face. It struck him hard on the cheek, leaving a small red mark before bouncing away and rolling under a nearby table. Lauren did not say a single word to him. She simply turned her back on her groom, grabbed her mother Vivian by the arm, and stormed out of the ruined ballroom with her head held high. The remaining country club guests immediately began to follow them, rushing toward the exits, desperate to distance themselves from the radioactive mess my family had become. Terrence watched his beautiful, wealthy bride walk out the door, and reality finally crashed down on him. The genius facade was gone. The billionaire lifestyle was gone. The safety net was gone. He dropped completely to his knees, right there in the middle of the dance floor, and began sobbing like a terrified child. He buried his face in his hands, wailing and gasping for air, his broad shoulders shaking with pathetic, heavy heaves. The golden boy was completely broken, reduced to a weeping mess in a ruined tuxedo. Brenda watched her precious son collapse, and a new kind of panic washed over her. The reality of the eviction notice and the absolute loss of her social empire finally broke through her delusion. She scrambled across the marble floor, crawling on her hands and knees through the spilled flour water and the smashed cake. She reached my feet and grabbed the fabric of my silk bridesmaid dress, her fingers digging into my leg. She looked up at me with tears streaming down her face, ruining her expensive makeup. She was hyperventilating, begging me to stop this nightmare. She screamed that I had to fix this right now. She yelled that blood is blood and that family takes care of family no matter what happens. She begged me to use the billions of dollars my software company was worth to just pay off the illegal loans and save the estate. She told me I owed it to them to save her son from financial ruin because we shared the same blood. I did not step away. I stood perfectly still and looked down at my mother with absolute ice in my veins. I stared into her desperate, pleading eyes and felt the last remaining thread of my childhood attachment completely dissolve into nothing. I kept my voice dangerously low and steady so she could hear every single word clearly. I told her that blood did not matter to her when I was 20 years old. I reminded her of the cold, rainy Tuesday when she decided I was too much of a financial burden and a disappointment to keep around. I told her exactly how it felt to come home from a grueling 14-hour shift at my minimum wage job, only to find that she had changed the locks on the front door. I reminded her how I banged on the windows for hours, begging to be let inside, while she sat in the living room ignoring me until I finally gave up and slept in my freezing car. I told her she had left me completely homeless without a second thought, just so she could focus all of her resources on Terrence and his fake startup dreams. I looked down at her shaking hands, clutching my dress, and stated that Vanguard Shield pays my bills today, not blood. Warren was still leaning against the broken vanity, his face buried in his hands, but he looked up when he heard my words. He stared at his wife, realizing that she had been the one to lock me out all those years ago, while telling him that I had simply run away to be independent. The lies they had built their entire marriage on were unraveling just as fast as Terrence's fake empire. Warren slowly slid down the wall until he was sitting on the floor surrounded by broken glass and crushed dreams. He did not say a word to defend Brenda. He just stared at the floor, looking like a hollow, empty shell of a man. Brenda let go of my dress, her hands falling limp to her sides. She sat back on her heels, her mouth opening and closing as she tried to find a way to manipulate the situation, but there was no manipulation left to use. The truth was entirely out in the open, and it was suffocating her. Terrence continued to sob on the dance floor, completely oblivious to the conversation happening just a few feet away from him. He was lost in his own pathetic misery, mourning the loss of the stolen money and the fake prestige he thought he deserved. The few remaining guests who had stayed to watch the spectacle unfold were completely silent. The string quartet had packed up their instruments and fled long ago. The caterers had vanished, leaving trays of untouched expensive food sitting on the tables. The lavish $1 million wedding reception had been transformed into a quiet, devastating graveyard of my family toxic secrets. I took a deep breath, feeling a profound sense of closure washing over me. The years of emotional abuse, the constant comparisons, the gaslighting, and the financial sabotage were finally over. I had proven my worth not by seeking their approval, but by letting their own greed completely destroy them. I adjusted my bag on my shoulder and prepared to turn around and walk out the door, leaving them to rot in the mess they had created for themselves. But just as I shifted my weight to leave, a loud, booming sound echoed from the far end of the reception hall. The heavy double oak doors of the main ballroom entrance suddenly swung violently open, crashing against the walls. The heavy thud made Brenda jump and caused Terrence to stop his sobbing and look up in sheer terror. 5 tall, broad-shouldered men marched into the room, moving with a swift, calculated, and highly trained precision. They were not country club security guards, and they were not local police responding to a simple theft call. They were all wearing dark tactical windbreakers with 3 bright yellow letters printed boldly across the back and chest. FBI. They bypassed the few lingering guests, completely ignoring the ruined cake and the spilled water, and marched directly onto the dance floor, heading straight for my brother. The 5 federal agents did not hesitate or slow their pace as their heavy boots crushed the scattered white flower petals into the wet marble. They formed a tight, inescapable circle around my brother. Terrence was still kneeling in the puddle of his own, making his hands covering his face, but the heavy sound of their boots made him look up. His eyes widened in absolute terror as he stared at the bright yellow letters printed across their dark jackets. He tried to scramble backward like a frightened animal slipping on the crushed wedding cake, but one of the agents grabbed him by the collar of his ruined silk shirt and hauled him roughly to his feet. The lead agent, a tall man with steel-gray hair and a voice that commanded immediate obedience, did not even glance at the weeping mess of my mother or the broken shell of my father. He looked dead into Terrence's bloodshot eyes and began reciting his Miranda rights. The words echoed through the cavernous ballroom, bouncing off the crystal chandeliers and sinking deep into the bones of every single person left in the room. The cold metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs snapping shut around Terrence's wrists sounded like a gunshot in the silent venue. But the agent did not arrest him for stealing the Vanguard shield source code. That was just a drop in the bucket. The agent loudly declared that Terrence was being taken into federal custody for massive corporate embezzlement, wire fraud, and international money laundering. The agent announced to the silent room that the Bureau had been tracking Terrence's financial movements for the past 8 months. He had not just lied about creating my software, he had actively stolen millions of dollars from his previous angel investors. He had funneled their massive investment capital through a complex web of shell companies and offshore bank accounts in the Cayman Islands just to fund his fake billionaire lifestyle. Every single cent used to pay for this lavish country club wedding. The imported orchids, the designer tuxedo, the private jets, the massive diamond ring Lauren had just thrown at his face had been stolen from people who trusted his golden boy facade. Warren let out a pathetic, choking gasp from his corner of the room. His brain simply could not process the magnitude of his son's criminal empire. Brenda stared at Terrence with her mouth hanging wide open, completely paralyzed by the realization that her perfect son, the boy she had sacrificed my entire life to protect, was going to spend the rest of his natural life in a federal penitentiary. The flashing red and blue lights of local police cruisers were now reflecting through the tall glass windows of the ballroom, signaling that the entire perimeter was locked down. Terrence began to violently thrash against the grip of the federal agents. Panic completely consumed him. His perfectly styled hair was plastered to his sweating forehead, and spit flew from his lips as he frantically searched for a way out of the trap he had built for himself. He looked around the room, and his wild, desperate eyes landed directly on me. The golden child did exactly what he had done his entire life whenever he was in trouble. He blamed his sister. He pointed his bound hands toward me and began to scream at the top of his lungs. He yelled that I did it. He screamed to the federal agents that I was the master hacker and that I had set him up to take the fall. His voice cracked and pitched into a hysterical whine as he claimed I was a vindictive, jealous loser who had framed him because I could not stand seeing him happy and successful. He begged the agents to let him go and arrest me instead. He shouted that I was a criminal mastermind who had hacked into the banking servers to route the stolen money into his personal accounts, just to destroy his beautiful marriage and humiliate his loving family. Warren, desperate to cling to the last shred of his delusional reality, stumbled forward on his hands and knees. He looked at the lead agent and pleaded with him to listen to Terrence. Warren swore on his life that his son was a good, honest Christian man with a brilliant future who would never steal a dime. He pointed a shaking hand at me and told the FBI that I was a troubled ghetto dropout who had stolen from their church 5 years ago, and that I was clearly capable of orchestrating this entire malicious digital setup to ruin them. I just stood there leaning casually against the edge of the DJ booth, watching the two men completely unravel in their own pathetic and desperate lies. I did not say a single word to defend myself against their wild accusations. I did not have to. The lead FBI agent looked at Terrence screaming and thrashing and simply shook his head with an expression of profound pity and absolute disgust. He did not argue with my brother. He did not even acknowledge my father's desperate, pathetic pleas. The agent completely ignored them both. He turned his broad back on the crying golden boy and walked across the wet marble floor, stopping directly in front of me. The entire ballroom held its breath, fully expecting him to place me in handcuffs based on Terrence's frantic accusations. Instead, the tall, gray-haired agent stood up straight and extended a firm, respectful hand toward me. I reached out and shook it confidently, feeling the rough calluses on his palm. The agent looked me in the eye and spoke in a loud, clear tone, deliberately ensuring that his voice carried across the dead-silent room for everyone to hear. He thanked me for providing the Bureau with the encrypted digital forensics logs and the offshore banking algorithms that tracked the missing funds. He stated that the Department of Justice deeply appreciates the ongoing cooperation of Vanguard Shield in tracking down these high-level corporate frauds. He called me Mom with the utmost respect, treating me not like a suspect or a troubled dropout, but like a highly valued expert colleague. The words hung in the air, heavy and absolute. Terrence immediately stopped fighting the guards. His jaw dropped open and his eyes bulged out of his skull as the horrifying realization hit him with the force of a speeding train. The sister he had mocked for years, the girl his parents had kicked out onto the freezing street. The woman he had just tried to frame for his own federal crimes was not just a successful tech CEO. She was a top-tier cybersecurity contractor for the United States federal government. He had literally tried to steal from and extort the exact same person the FBI used to catch international criminals. The sheer, unadulterated shock on Terrence's face as the agents dragged him toward the exit was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen in my entire life. The reality of his impending imprisonment finally broke through Terrence's massive ego as the federal agents hauled him by his arms across the wet marble floor. His custom-tailored silk tuxedo dragged through the remnants of the smashed wedding cake, leaving a sticky white trail behind him. He kicked his expensive leather shoes against the floor, desperately trying to find traction. But the agents were relentless. He started thrashing wildly like a spoiled toddler throwing a tantrum in a grocery store. He craned his neck backward, looking for the one person who had always fixed his mistakes and shielded him from the consequences of his actions. He began to scream for our mother, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, pathetic wail that echoed off the vaulted ceilings. He begged Brenda to call someone to fix this, to tell the FBI that there had been a huge mistake. He cried out that his wrists hurt, that the handcuffs were too tight, that he was not meant for a federal holding cell. Brenda tried to scramble after him, her emerald gown completely soaked and ruined. But one of the agents held up a stern hand, warning her to stay back or face charges for interfering with a federal arrest. The heavy oak doors of the ballroom slammed shut behind them, cutting off Terrence's desperate sobbing. The sudden silence in the reception hall was deafening. The few country club guests who had lingered to watch the spectacle were now backing away toward the emergency exits, completely horrified by the total collapse of our family. Warren was still kneeling on the floor, surrounded by the shattered glass of the vanity. He looked up at me with tears streaming down his face, his chest heaving with heavy, ragged sobs. The stern moral authority he had always weaponized against me was completely gone. He was just a broken old man who had bet his entire life on the wrong child. Warren dragged himself across the floor until he was sitting at my feet. He looked up at me, his hands clasped together in a desperate pleading gesture. He told me that I had to do something. He cried that I had the money and the influence with the federal government to fix this nightmare. He begged me to use the billions of dollars my company was worth to hire the absolute best criminal defense lawyers in the country. He pleaded with me to drain my accounts if necessary just to bail Terrence out and keep him from spending the rest of his life in a federal penitentiary. He swore that Terrence was just misguided, that the pressure of succeeding had driven him to make poor choices, and that he did not deserve to have his entire life destroyed over a simple financial mistake. I looked down at my father and felt a wave of absolute revulsion wash over me. Even now, after seeing the undeniable proof that Terrence had stolen millions of dollars, ruined countless lives, and nearly destroyed my own future, Warren was still making excuses for him. I stood perfectly still and told him no. I told him I would not spend a single cent of my Vanguard Shield money to save a fraud. I explained that every dollar I had earned was built on my own late nights, my own sacrifices, and my own grueling hard work while they were busy kicking me out onto the street. I told him Terrence was finally getting exactly what he deserved, and I was going to sit back and watch him rot in a federal cell. Warren's face twisted with a sudden desperate anger. He tried to fall back on the only weapon he had ever successfully used against me. He raised his voice, trying to sound commanding, and told me that a good Christian daughter honors her father. He quoted scripture at me right there on the ruined dance floor, telling me that family forgives family, and that holding on to this kind of vengeance was a sin that would taint my soul forever. He tried to use his decades of preaching to shame me into submission, demanding that I perform my familial duty and obey his direct orders to save my brother. I did not flinch. I leaned down slightly so I was looking directly into his tear-filled eyes, and I snapped right back at him. I told him that a good Christian father does not rob his daughter's future to fund a criminal. The words hit him like a physical blow, making him flinch and shrink back. I reminded him of all the times he had stolen the money I saved from my part-time jobs just to pay off Terrence's credit card debts. I reminded him how he had stood behind the pulpit every single Sunday, preaching about honesty and integrity, while quietly helping his golden boy hide his financial crimes from the congregation. I told him he had absolutely no right to lecture me about morality or family loyalty when he had spent my entire life treating me like a disposable asset. Brenda watched her husband collapse into a weeping mess and realized that I was truly untouchable. My money, my company, my power were completely out of her reach. She could not shame me, she could not guilt me, and she could not force me to save her precious son. The despair in her eyes instantly morphed into pure, unadulterated malice. If she was going to lose everything, she was determined to make sure I lost something too. She stood up, her ruined dress clinging to her legs, and glared at me with a hatred so deep it made the air in the room feel heavy. She pointed a shaking manicured finger at my chest and screamed that it was fine. She yelled that if I wanted to be a heartless monster and abandon my own flesh and blood, she would play the exact same game. She took a step toward me, her voice dripping with venom as she revealed her absolute last trump card. She reminded me that she still held full legal power of attorney over my grandmother, $2 million trust fund. The very same trust fund that my grandmother had explicitly intended for me to use for my future. Brenda smiled a sick, twisted smile and swore to me right then and there that she would drain every single penny from those accounts. She screamed that she would burn the entire $2 million to the ground before she ever let me see a single dime. Brenda did not hesitate for a single second. She reached into the bodice of her ruined emerald gown and pulled out her smartphone, her hands shaking with absolute manic rage. She screamed that she was logging into the banking portal right this very second to wire every last cent of my inheritance to an untraceable offshore account in the Bahamas. She frantically tapped at her screen, her eyes wide and wild, declaring that she would rather face federal wire fraud charges than let an ungrateful, wretched daughter have a single dime of that $2 million. She spat out that if I was going to leave my brother to rot in a prison cell, she was going to make sure I ended up just as destitute as they were. I watched her fingers flying across the glowing screen, and I did not panic. I did not lunge forward to stop her. I did not even raise my voice. Instead, I slowly turned my back on my mother and walked over to an abandoned catering table near the edge of the ruined dance floor. I picked up an unopened crystal bottle of vintage champagne in a clean glass. The soft pop of the cork echoing across the silent room made Brenda look up in sheer confusion. I calmly poured myself a fresh glass of the sparkling wine, watching the bubbles rise to the top. Then I let out a soft, genuine laugh. The sound of my laughter completely unnerved her. Brenda stared at me like I had lost my mind, her thumb hovering over the transfer button on her screen. I took a slow sip of my champagne and looked at her over the rim of the crystal glass. I told her to go ahead and press confirm. I told her to try her absolute best to steal the only thing my grandmother had ever left me. Brenda growled and smashed her finger against the screen, but her face instantly fell. The banking app froze and a bright red error message flashed across her display, stating that her access was permanently denied. She frantically tapped the screen over and over again, screaming at the phone and demanding to know what I had done. She swiped, refreshed, and typed in her passwords with frantic, desperate movements, but the red warning sign refused to disappear. I walked back over to her, taking my time listening to her frustrated, aggressive grunts. I stood over her and told her that I had not done anything at all. I explained that Grandma Dorothy had always known exactly who Brenda was. My grandmother had seen right through her greedy, status-obsessed facade decades ago. Grandma Dorothy knew that Brenda only valued people for what they could provide financially, and she knew that if Brenda ever got desperate, she would absolutely try to drain my trust fund to save her own skin, or to bail out her precious golden boy Terrence. I looked down at my mother's terrified face and explained the brilliant safety net my grandmother had secretly built into the legal framework of the trust all those years ago. I told Brenda that her power of attorney was never absolute. It was just a temporary illusion to keep her satisfied until I was ready. Grandmother had explicitly written a hidden clause deep within the legal paperwork, stating that Brenda control over the $2 million would be immediately and permanently revoked the exact second my personal net worth exceeded $10 million. Brenda's jaw dropped open as she stared at the red error message on her phone, completely unable to comprehend what was happening. She had spent my entire life calling me a failure and a disappointment. She had actively tried to destroy my confidence and sabotage my independence at every single turn. She simply could not process the fact that the daughter she threw away like garbage had bypassed the $10 million threshold without her ever noticing. She shook her head wildly, claiming it was impossible and that my little tech startup could not possibly be worth that much money. She screamed that it had to be a bank error and that she was going to call her lawyers first thing in the morning to fix it. She yelled that I was just a lucky little brat and that she still had the legal right to control my life. I reached into my leather designer handbag one last time. I pulled out a crisp, thick document stamped with the official seals of the bank and the estate lawyers. I held the final piece of paper out toward her so she could clearly read the bold black ink across the top page. I watched the last remaining drop of hope drain from her eyes as I told her that the Vanguard Shield valuation had completely skyrocketed after our latest government contract. I looked her dead in the eye and told her that my personal net worth had officially hit $150 million last Tuesday. I explained that the hidden clause had been triggered and the entire trust had automatically dissolved yesterday afternoon, transferring every single penny directly into my private accounts, safely out of her greedy reach forever. I took another slow sip of my champagne and told my mother that she had exactly $0 to her name. The heavy smartphone slipped from Brenda's limp fingers and crashed onto the hard marble floor, shattering the screen into dozens of jagged pieces. Her chest began to heave erratically, and she clutched at her throat, gasping for air. She was not faking it this time. Her face turned a mottled shade of red, and a terrible wheezing sound escaped her lips as she stared at the shattered phone on the ground, finally realizing that she had absolutely nothing left to steal and nowhere left to run. She was completely, entirely, and permanently ruined. Brenda remained on her hands and knees, clutching her chest as her shattered phone lay in pieces around her. The harsh reality of her absolute poverty hit her so hard she could barely draw breath. The grand ballroom, which had been booked to showcase their immense wealth and unquestionable social dominance, had transformed into an execution chamber for their reputation. The remaining guests, consisting of Atlanta elite socialites and the most prominent members of their megachurch congregation, did not rush forward to help my mother. Instead, they pulled out their smartphones. The glowing screens illuminated the dim room as dozens of people began recording the pathetic downfall of the Golden family. These were the exact same people Brenda had spent the last 30 years sucking up to the country club wives and charity board members she had alienated me to impress. Now they were looking at her like she was a diseased animal. The murmurs and whispers rippled through the crowd, carrying words like fraud and thief and fake. Warren, realizing that their meticulously crafted public image was evaporating in real time, scrambled to his feet. He reached out a shaking hand toward a wealthy deacon he had played golf with just yesterday. The deacon physically recoiled, taking a massive step backward as if Warren were contagious. Warren opened his mouth to offer some pathetic excuse, but the crowd parted to make way for a much more imposing figure. Senior Pastor Davis walked slowly across the wet marble floor. He was a man who commanded absolute respect, a pillar of the community who had personally endorsed Warren for his prestigious positions on the church executive board. Warren's face immediately lit up with a desperate, sickening hope. He stumbled toward the pastor, calling out his name, begging for grace and pastoral understanding. He blabbered that the devil was attacking their family and that they needed the church to stand behind them in this hour of spiritual warfare. Pastor Davis did not offer his hand. He stopped a few feet away from my father and looked down at him with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. The pastor's voice boomed across the silent room, cold and absolute. He told Warren to stop using God to cover up his crimes. He stated clearly that the church would not be dragged into a federal embezzlement scandal to protect a family of liars. Warren began to openly weep, pleading that he had no idea what Terrence was doing. But the pastor simply shook his head. Pastor Davis leaned in closer and delivered the final fatal blow to my father's entire existence. He told Warren, "Do not ever step foot in my church again." He announced in front of the entire congregation that Warren was stripped of his board position immediately and that a full independent audit would be conducted on every single church account Warren had ever touched. The pastor turned his back and walked away, leaving Warren gasping for air as his entire identity, his power, his status, and his community were instantly vaporized. The social annihilation was absolute and total. I stood quietly by the catering table watching the people who had abused me for my entire life finally reap exactly what they had sown. The guests were now filing out of the ballroom, fast, sending their videos to local news blogs and spreading the scandal across social media. The prestigious country club staff were already boxing up the remaining food and calling a cleanup crew, completely ignoring my parents who were still sobbing on the ruined floor. The pristine illusion of the perfect Christian family was completely shattered beyond any hope of repair. Their mansion would likely be seized by federal authorities to pay back the stolen investor funds, and they would be left with absolutely nothing. As I watched the final remnants of the crowd disperse, I noticed a figure slithering out from the shadows near the exit. It was Victoria, the fiercely snobby older sister of the bride Lauren. Just an hour ago, Victoria had sneered at me in the lobby, mocking my clothes and treating me like garbage because she thought I was just a broke dropout who did not belong at her sister's luxury wedding. But things had changed. Victoria had stood in the corner and watched the entire confrontation. She had heard the FBI confirm my government contracts, and more importantly, she had heard the exact number of my newly unlocked net worth. Victoria approached me completely, ignoring the fact that her sister's marriage had just ended in a federal arrest and that her new in-laws were weeping on the floor. The sheer predatory greed in her eyes was almost impressive. She plastered on a bright fake smile and stepped uncomfortably close to me, her expensive perfume making my nose itch. She reached into her designer clutch and pulled out a thick, embossed business card. She held the card out to me, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness and slimy admiration. She told me that she always knew I was the smart one in the family. She completely threw her own sister and Terence under the bus, stating that they were fools for crossing me. Then, with a conspiratorial wink, she suggested that we should do lunch next week at her private club to talk about some exclusive investment portfolios she managed. She actually thought that flattering me would grant her access to my money. She believed I was just as desperate for high society approval as my parents were. I did not say a single word. I looked at the heavy cardstock in her outstretched hand, and then I looked directly into her desperate, hungry eyes. I slowly reached out and took the business card from her fingers. Victoria's smile widened, thinking she had successfully secured a new billionaire client. Maintaining absolute eye contact, I gripped the edges of the card and deliberately ripped it perfectly in half. The sound of the thick paper tearing wiped the smile clean off her face. I shifted my gaze to the glass of vintage champagne she was holding in her other hand. Without breaking the silence, I dropped the torn pieces of her card directly into her champagne. I watched the expensive paper sink to the bottom of the bubbling liquid, ruining her drink and her pathetic attempt to extract my wealth. Victoria's jaw fell open in silent shock as I turned on my heel and walked toward the exit, leaving the ruins of the wedding and the ruins of my family far behind me forever. I did not make it all the way out the heavy oak doors. A pathetic whimpering sound echoed across the wet marble floor, stopping me in my tracks. I slowly turned back around. The massive reception hall was completely deserted now. The elite guests, the wealthy investors, and the hypocritical church congregation had vanished like ghosts, eager to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout of my family. It was just me and the two broken people sitting in the sticky ruins of what was supposed to be their ultimate triumph. Crushed orchid petals and smashed crystal glasses covered the wet floor around them. Warren and Brenda were huddled together amid the overturned chairs, looking like frightened animals trapped in a cage of their own making. They had absolutely nothing left in this world. Their golden child was sitting in a cold federal holding cell. Their massive bank accounts were frozen or completely dissolved, and their prestigious social standing had just been publicly executed in front of everyone they had ever cared about. Warren dragged his heavy body up from the floor and stumbled toward me. He did not have the arrogant, confident stride of a megachurch board member anymore. He shuffled like a broken beggar, his shoulders slumped and his hands trembling. Brenda trailed closely behind him, her ruined emerald gown dragging through the spilled champagne and smashed wedding cake. Her expensive makeup was running down her face in dark, jagged lines, making her look hollow and terrified. They stopped a few feet away from me, entirely too scared to get any closer. Warren stared at the floor, unable to meet my gaze, and his voice shook violently as he spoke. He asked me in a weak, pathetic whisper what it would take for them to keep the house. He admitted that the federal authorities were going to seize all their remaining assets to pay off the investors Terence had defrauded, and that they had absolutely nowhere else to go. Brenda started crying again, a genuine ugly sob begging me not to let them end up on the street. She pleaded that they were too old to start over and that they would not survive out there with no money and no friends. I looked at them shivering in their ruined designer clothes, and I felt a cold, absolute calm wash over my entire body. I walked over to one of the few standing cocktail tables and leaned casually against it. I told them that before we even discussed real estate, they were going to do something they had avoided doing for my entire life. I told them they were going to stand right there and confess every single thing they had done to me out loud. Warren hesitated, his jaw tightening out of pure stubborn habit, but I just crossed my arms and stared him down. I told him that if he lied, if he left out a single detail, or if he tried to justify any of his actions, I would walk out that door and let the federal agents throw them out on the curb tomorrow morning. Slowly and painfully, the ugly truth finally began to spill from their lips. Warren spoke first, his voice cracking as he admitted that he had stolen my college savings to buy Terrence a new luxury car because he truly believed my education was a total waste of money. He confessed that he had lied to the church congregation about me claiming I was a troubled thief just to cover up Terrence's massive gambling debts and protect his own reputation. Brenda, crying so hard she could barely breathe, admitted that she had deliberately sabotaged my relationship with my grandmother because she was terrified that Grandma Dorothy loved me more than her. She confessed out loud that she had thrown me out into the freezing winter night. Not because I was a bad daughter, but because my intelligence and independence threatened her absolute control over the family dynamic. They stood there stripping away decades of their delusional good Christian parent narrative word by painful word. They confessed that they had knowingly funded Terrence's lavish lifestyle with stolen money, while telling me I was a worthless burden who did not deserve to eat at their table. Every single admission echoed in the cavernous, empty room, permanently breaking the mental chains they had wrapped around my mind for 25 years. When they finally fell silent, there was nothing left but the raw, undeniable truth. They looked at me with hollow, desperate eyes, waiting for absolution, waiting for the good, forgiving daughter to wipe their slate clean. Instead, I reached into my leather bag and pulled out a thick stack of stapled papers. I dropped the document onto the cocktail table, letting it land with a heavy, definitive thud. I told them it was a brutal, ironclad lease agreement drawn up by the top corporate lawyers at Vanguard Shield. I told them that they were not keeping the mansion. I explained that my company had just purchased the foreclosed property directly from the bank in cash. The main house was going to be completely gutted and renovated. But I looked down at them and told them they could stay in the drafty, unrenovated carriage house out back by the service entrance. Warren and Brenda stared at the legal document in absolute shock as I laid out the rest of the terms. I told them that they worked for me now. They would be solely responsible for maintaining the entire estate grounds. Warren would be mowing the massive lawns, trimming the hedges, and cleaning the pool, while Brenda would be scrubbing the floors, pulling weeds on her hands and knees, and maintaining the property exteriors. I slid the paper across the table and told them they would be paying me strict market rent for the privilege of living in that tiny carriage house. That rent was due on the first of every single month without exception. If they missed a single payment, if they complained about the manual labor, or if they ever tried to contact me outside of their property management duties, the lease would be instantly terminated and they would be thrown out onto the street. Brenda let out a sharp, terrified gasp, fully realizing the brutal magnitude of her new reality. The woman who had spent her entire life obsessed with country club status and luxury brands was now officially my hired help. Warren's hands shook violently as he reached out and picked up the heavy silver pen I had placed next to the contract. He did not argue. He did not try to quote scripture or negotiate a better deal. He knew deep down that this was the absolute best offer he was ever going to get. I watched them silently sign their names on the dotted lines, legally signing away the very last shreds of their pride and their toxic entitlement. I took the signed contract back, slipping it securely into my bag. I did not say goodbye, and I did not wish them well. I just turned around and walked out through the heavy oak doors, stepping out into the cool, crisp night air, leaving them alone in the dark to clean up their own mess. The heavy oak doors clicked shut behind me with a final echoing thud, permanently sealing away the pathetic weeping of the people who used to be my parents. The cool, crisp night air of Atlanta hit my face instantly, washing away the suffocating stench of Brenda-ruined designer perfume and the stale, depressing scent of crushed orchids. I stood alone on the grand stone steps of the elite country club, taking a deep, slow breath of genuine freedom for the absolute first time in my entire life. The frantic, flashing red and blue lights of the federal police cruisers had already faded into the distance, taking Terrence and his shattered golden boy illusion away to a cold, concrete cell. At the bottom of the grand sweeping staircase, the valet lane was completely empty except for one solitary vehicle. A sleek black chauffeur-driven Maybach idled quietly under the warm amber glow of the gas lanterns. Leaning elegantly against the polished rear door of the massive luxury car was Vivian Sinclair, the ruthlessly successful venture capitalist who had just watched my brother completely self-destruct inside the ballroom, was now waiting patiently alone in the damp night air. She did not look shaken by the scandal, and she certainly did not look like a victim who had almost been defrauded out of a fortune. Vivian did not look at me with the pity or the condescension that my family always had. She looked at me with the sharp, assessing gaze of an apex predator, recognizing another apex predator in the wild. She pushed herself off the side of the Maybach and walked toward me, the heels of her expensive shoes clicking sharply against the wet pavement. She did not bother with fake pleasantries or dramatic apologies for almost funding my brother's stolen code. Instead, she reached into her tailored blazer and pulled out a thick leather-bound portfolio. She handed it to me without a single ounce of hesitation. I opened the heavy leather flap and looked down at the pristine legal documents resting inside. It was a fully executed legitimate partnership contract between Vivian Massive Investment Firm and Vanguard Shield. I scanned the first few paragraphs, letting my trained eyes catch all the important details. There were no hidden clauses, no predatory terms, and absolutely no attempts to steal my intellectual property like Terrence had tried to pull. I flipped directly to the final page and saw her elegant looping signature resting boldly beneath a completely staggering figure, an upfront capital injection of exactly $500 million. Vivian smiled a sharp, genuine smile that reached all the way to her piercing eyes. She looked at me with absolute professional reverence. She stated clearly that it is an honor to finally do business with the real genius. I felt a warm, quiet satisfaction bloom in my chest, replacing decades of doubt and manipulation. I looked back at the woman who had the power to make or break international empires, and I smiled right back at her. I simply told her likewise. The uniformed chauffeur stepped out from the shadows and respectfully opened the heavy rear door of the Maybach for me. I slid into the plush leather interior, the quiet, unparalleled luxury of the cabin wrapping around me like a protective armor. Vivian tapped the roof of the car twice, signaling the driver, and then turned to walk toward her own waiting vehicle. The heavy engine of the Maybach hummed to life with a low, powerful purr, and the long black car began to glide smoothly down the winding, tree-lined driveway of the country club. As we pulled onto the main road, leaving the sprawling iron gates of the estate far behind us in the rearview mirror, the dark interior of the car was suddenly illuminated by a soft blue glow. My phone was resting face up on the center console. A secured notification from my offshore corporate banking app flashed quietly across the lock screen. It was short, simple, and absolutely world-shifting. The text read, "Incoming wire transfer, $500 million cleared." I let out a long, slow breath, letting the immense reality of that money sink deep into my bones. I opened my leather handbag and bypassed the ironclad lease agreement that now made my parents my permanent, miserable employees. My fingers brushed past the signed Vanguard documents and landed on a small velvet box tucked deep in the side pocket. I pulled it out into the dim light of the cabin and popped the lid open. Resting on the dark silk was my grandmother's stunning vintage sapphire necklace. The exact necklace Brenda had tried so desperately to steal from me because she thought I was unworthy of wearing it. The exact necklace that proved Grandma Dorothy had always known my true worth, long before my bank accounts proved it to the rest of the world. I lifted the heavy platinum chain from the box, feeling the cool weight of the metal against my skin. I reached around the back of my neck and fastened the clasp, letting the brilliant blue stones rest perfectly against my collarbone. I leaned my head back against the soft leather headrest and turned to look out the tinted window. The bright, blurring lights of the Atlanta skyline rushed past in the dark, carrying me toward a future that belonged entirely to me. I was finally completely free, victorious, and impossibly wealthy. The ultimate lesson from this ordeal is that true security never comes from seeking validation from those determined to misunderstand you. Blood does not automatically make someone family, especially when they use that connection to manipulate and drain you. True power is found in walking away, building your own empire in silence, and letting your absolute success be the only response you ever give to their cruelty. You do not owe abusers a place in your future just because they share your past. Have you ever had to cut off toxic relatives? Please share your story in the comments below.